A papal banquet, 1,000 candles, chestnuts scattered across marble. By dawn, Europe had a new word for sin and a story it would never forget. Tonight, we slip through a door that most history classes left closed. We'll walk the gleaming corridors of the Renaissance Vatican. We'll listen to diaries written in the cramped hands of masters of ceremonies. We'll sift humanist letters, breathless pamphlets, and the splinters of satire pinned to a Roman statue called Pasquino. Our subject is not the theology of the papacy. It's something older, rawer, and harder to hold. The messy border between piety and pleasure. The rumors, the rituals, the nights people still whisper about. We'll ask, what did orgy mean to a Roman of 1500? What do we really trust about the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts? Who were the courtesans who dined beside cardinals? The poets who turned their lives into moral fables? And the enemies who sharpened their knives with scandal? And why did some popes and many more courtiers live like princes in a city that wanted them to be saints? We begin with context. Rome itself. The smell of beeswax and incense in the papal chapel. Wine warming in silver cups. A city where every feast had a fast, and where every fast produced a craving. Ready? Step softly. It's late. The candles are already lit. If you've ever walked into a room and felt a story humming in its walls, you already know Renaissance Rome. Imagine a papal court that was part monastery, part monarchy, and part theater. The Sistine Chapel a marvel of paint and chant. The Belvedere courtyard a playground for spectacle. The Lateran and Apostolic Palace alive with clerks, petitioners, guards, fools, singers, and the heavy footfall of men in red. You could taste the power. Literally. Wine flowed at receptions, layered with protocol. The papal household staff kitchens capable of feeding princes and ambassadors on an hour's notice. Kitchens, not chapels, turned rumor into steam. It wasn't only what was cooked. It was who sat where, who entered with whom, whose name the master of ceremonies scribbled in a margin. For medieval and Renaissance Europeans, the papacy was supposed to be the conscience of Christendom, the mouth that said no when kings said yes. But it was also a government, with all the merciless gravity that government entails, salaries to pay, favors to repay, alliances to cement. Every sovereign's court had its dancers and banquets, its masks and mimes. And Rome, even when it pretended otherwise, was not immune to the pleasures and pressures of a capital city. Consider the feast cycle. Lent's austerity was matched by Carnival's license. Weeks before Ash Wednesday, when Roman streets erupted with masquerades, horse races, and floats, when anonymity could be purchased with a mask and a costume, when inhibitions were suspended in the name of collective misrule. Carnival wasn't a uniquely papal extravagance. It was an European rite of inversion. But in the shadow of St. Peter's, the symbolism compounded. Did the church sanction this? Did it secretly bask in it? Or did it simply fail to squeeze the city into a shape it could approve? The papal court sat at that intersection. It was an office. It was a family. It was a stage. Cardinals arrived with retinues and tastes formed in Ferrara, Florence, or Naples. Some came from princely houses, like the Medici, accustomed to pageantry and the satin language of magnificence. Others were administrators who could stretch a coin further than most monarchs. They all understood optics. A dazzling party that was politics in another key. And yet, amid marble and silence, it doesn't take much for spectacle to turn into scandal. A jest overheard, a dance too close, a gift too lavish, a night that ran too long, and the city's rumor mill ground its flour. Add enemies. Every pope had those. The old Roman baronial clans. The covetous monarchs of France and Spain. The friars and preachers who watched the world through the slit of moral judgment. Put ink in their hands, and you have the raw material for a legend. Remember this when we reach the night of the chestnuts. Rome was always half stage, half courtroom. The indictments were being written even as the candles were still warming the wax. And yes, one autumn evening did more to fix the image of papal orgy than any other. We're almost there. It is October 1501. Some sources say October 30th. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, presides over a court that glitters and horrifies in equal measure. He's the Spanish pope whose charisma and calculation have redrawn the map of Italy. His son Cesare is the sword arm of the family, the dark star Europeans identify with ambition itself. His daughter Lucrezia is married, again, this time advantageously. The Borgias are, to their enemies, the face of every rumor they ever feared about Rome. And then, the banquet. The most famous account belongs to a man with no need to invention, Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies. He kept a meticulous diary of court events. The Latin is cool, clipped bureaucratic. It records audiences, masses, receptions, and dinners. Tucked amid these entries is one that would be quoted, magnified, and mythologized for centuries. Burchard claims that a banquet was held in the Apostolic Palace, attended by the Pope, his family, and courtiers. After the dinner, he writes, candelabra were removed from the tables and set upon the floor. Chestnuts were scattered. A number of courtesans, he gives a number, some say 50, danced, and then, amid the candles, crawled to collect the chestnuts. There were games of a sexual nature. Prizes were offered. Some sources say silks and fine garments were given to the winners. Some retellings add lurid details. Contests of endurance, a tally kept by flickering light, the Pope himself presiding. It is an account almost too perfect for enemies to resist. The Pope's household at play, the sensuality of a pagan rite, chestnuts on marble, bodies glistening in wax light, all within the walls of the Vatican. For many later readers, this was proof, not merely that churchmen were sinful, but that sin had set up furniture in the very heart of the church. But the historian's voice must lower here. Burchard's diary exists in multiple manuscripts. Modern scholars have argued about the integrity of this entry. Some accept it as authentic. Others, notably the early 20th century Monsignor Peter de Rue and a line of defenders of Alexander VI's reputation, suggested that the passage might be a later interpolation, or at least colored by hostile retelling. There is no copy of Burchard's text written in the year 1501 that we can point to and say, this is the unaltered original. We are always reading editions and translations that pass through other hands. Still, it's hard to wave this away entirely. Burchard was not a Protestant propagandist. He was the same man who recorded dozens of ceremonies, processions, and the fine points of curial precedents. His eye is dull with accuracy. The tone of the Chestnuts passage is just as cold as his other entries. Many reputable historians, while cautious, treat the event as likely, not because they crave scandal, but because the Borgias themselves built a court where magnificence, masks, and carnal license were not strangers. Even so, take a breath and ask a simple question. What would orgy mean in this context? In Italian of the time, orgia could mean an unrestrained feast, a bacchanal, a wild party, not necessarily a mass of anonymous bodies. Courtesans were present in elite Italian life. They were educated, poised, living at the edges of aristocratic households. They were patrons' companions, poets' muses, and, yes, a scandal in waiting. Rome, like Venice and Florence, had famous names: Imperia Cognati, Fiammetta, Trudia d'Agona. If some were present at the Vatican, and some sources say they were more than once, this does not yet tell us what precisely happened in the dark. Was beyond doubt. The Borgias threw feasts. The Borgias broke taboos. The Borgias turned enemies into narrators. Every gesture became a script. When Alexander's friend and ally died, enemies called it poison. When Alexander himself died, perhaps of fever, some sources claimed he drank a goblet intended for someone else. Sin, slander, and politics were inseparable in 1501. It is telling that Rome did not erupt in outrage the next day. There was no immediate purge, no proclamations. Scandal, even when whispered, rarely knocks on the door of the powerful in daylight. The story truly spread when foes needed it. After the Borgias' fortunes turned, after semi-fictional chronicles made their rounds, after Protestant pamphleteers found in the chestnuts a perfect emblem of decay. And yet, despite the fog, the image persists. Candles on marble, chestnuts rolling into shadow, the soft glide of silk, laughter that lingers too long, a court parting its lips at the very moment it should have whispered a prayer. Step out with me. Close the door. Rome kept feasting. Our next doorway opens beneath a different crest. The balls of the Medici. The stage remains the same. The script changes key. Leo X, born Giovanni da Medici, was not the caricature of obscene excess. Not only that, he was a cultivated prince, the son of Lorenzo il Magnifico, bathed in humanist taste from childhood. When he became pope in 1513, Rome inhaled. Julius II, the warrior pope, had spent years in armor. Leo X traded breastplates for velvet. Art, theater, and music swelled in the papal orbit. It was dazzling. It was costly. It was, for many of Rome's moralists, suspicious. The city's carnival under Leo was exuberant. Picture mass processions along the Via Lata, plume-feathered youths staging masquerade, costumed rides from the palaces of cardinals to the Quirinal, improvisations of myth and satire, some biting, some bawdy, many elaborately costumed. In papal service was a master of ceremonies named Paris de Graces, whose diary, like Burchard's, is a trove of detail. He fretted about decorum. He recorded processions, fasts, papal audiences, and he noticed, with a frown, how easily the edges frayed. Humanist friends wrote comedies, like Cardinal Bibbienna's La Calandria, which some sources say was performed in Rome with sets that may have been touched by Raphael's hand. The courtyards of the Vatican became theaters. There is no shame in that. Courts across Europe stage such plays. Their aristocrats fancied themselves patrons of culture. Yet plays deal in desire. Masks invite license. In a city as morally surveilled as Rome, even a curtain can be a provocation. What of orgies? Here we must tread with the same care as before. Many of the wilder tales about Leo X are later inventions. He did not, as one hostile prankster wrote, die from too much good cheer. He died in 1521 of illness, leaving behind a court that had spent itself rich in art, music, and feasts. But there were dances in the Vatican. There were entertainments that edged into the sensual, particularly during Carnival. There were courtesans in Rome who moved among the powerful, their wit invited more often than their bodies, though both were on offer to those who sought them. Pietro Aretino, that dangerous pen for hire, wrote lubricious letters that threw sparks onto dry reputations. Paolo Giovio, a court historian, admired culture yet could not entirely close his eyes to its costs. Guicciardini, the Florentine statesman and historian, craned his neck from the north and judged. And Michelangelo, who made the very ceiling of the papal chapel a map of sacred muscle and prophecy, watched the city's theater with the eye of a man who knew both ornament and restraint. What may be truer than any single rumor is the sense that the Vatican, under Leo X, treated culture itself as a sacrament. Spectacle became a soft politics. Befriend princes with tournaments, impress ambassadors with fates, attract Europe's artists by making Rome the heart of a cultural empire. In such a world, the line between performance and indulgence grew faint. A court musician composed a motet for vespers, and a frottala for a mass ball. A painter gilded a papal hallway and sketched costumes for a comedy. The very movement between chapel and stage created the idea that there were nights when the stage absorbed the chapel. Did the papal apartments host orgies in the sense a modern listener imagines? Some sources say there were carnal games in high houses during Carnival, that masked revelers traded more than songs. Others defend the popes and their immediate households, insisting that bad behavior clustered among hangers-on. The households of cardinals, the salons of wealthy Romans, the private villas across the Tiber. Both could be true. Rome is a city of courtyards. What happens in one does not necessarily compromise the one next door. What we can say quietly is this: Leo X's court gave orgy its metaphoric teeth. It trained spectators to imagine decadence as an index of papal failure. And it trained moralists, as well as the reformers, to take art and pleasure themselves as evidence of sin. Once the music stopped, the words kept dancing. The lights dim on Leo's halls. We step back, way back, to an older scandal in an older Rome, where enemies said a pope turned the Lateran itself into a brothel. The legend has a name, the Pornocracy, and as always, the truth is harder and more human than the headline. Before there was a banquet of chestnuts, there was a century of knives. Historians call it, with a taste for melodrama, the saeculum obscurum, the dark age of the papacy. Later writers tagged it the Pornocracy, a label sticky with insinuation. The years of the 10th century, roughly 904 to 964. Rome is weak, its noble families, the Theophylax among them, strong. And a young pope named John XII becomes the focus of charges that make Borgia-era slander look almost polite. Our most colorful source is Liutprand of Cremona, diplomat, bishop, propagandist. He served German kings who needed Rome tamed. When John XII crossed them, Liutprand wrote like a man sharpening iron on a whetstone. His list of accusations against John is a catalog of moral panic: murder, sacrilege, perjury, incest, dice playing, and the transformation of the Lateran palace into a place of prostitution. He claims John toasted the devil and invoked pagan gods during dice games. He says John died in bed with a married woman, struck down by her enraged husband, or by apoplexy. The versions multiply. How much of this is true? We cannot know. John was very young when elected, perhaps 18, and by all accounts reckless. His reign was chaotic. He did meet his end abruptly, perhaps in a bed not his own. But Liutprand's prose is barbed. He wrote to justify the intervention of secular power in church affairs, to paint a picture so dark that imperial correction would look like salvation. Later moralists took his ink and made it blood. The phrase pornocracy itself is a later invention, a coinage of modern historians who wanted a name to gather together the influence of strong Roman noblewomen. Theodora, Marozia, accused, often without fair hearing, of trading sex for power and putting lovers or sons on Peter's throne. Some of it may be true. Much of it is likely gossip made indelible by repetition. What matters for our story is the template it's set, a way of talking about papal Rome in which sex becomes the master metaphor for corruption. If you're waiting for orgies in a modern sense, this is not where you find them. You find, instead, one-on-one sins weaponized into myths, the language of brothels pushed onto the architecture of the Lateran as a kind of curse. You find a city that lived with violence so routinely that the bed became an oddly convenient place to imagine justice meted out. A husband with a sword, a pope on the wrong side of a laugh. Why dwell here? Because the Pornocracy tells us how a rumor system works. Start with a sin that people can picture. Add a setting that feels sacred. Have a writer with a motive and an audience that needs to feel superior. Then wait. It takes on a life of its own. Centuries later, when Protestants sought to describe Rome, they reached for the same images. Whores, bacchanals, the very city as a female body selling itself to power. Old words crackle with new electricity. We step forward again to the 16th century's printing presses, to broadsheets with woodcuts that turned Rome's iniquity into public theater. This is the rumor machine that made the papal orgy a European tradition. If Rome had a conscience, it also had a street poet. His name was Pasquino, or rather, the name given to a battered ancient statue near Piazza Navona, on whose chest Romans taped witty, venomous verses. A pasquinade could skewer a cardinal's mistress, mock a papal nephew, or turn an offhand indulgence into a city's running joke. These scraps became Roman air, always there, always cutting, rarely provable, endlessly repeated. Then came the printing press. What had been local gossip became a European import. Luther's circle in Germany printed broadsides illustrating monstrous births. A papal ass found in the Tiber, a monkish fish with a human face. They were allegories of corruption, but they read like news. Woodcutters drew Rome as Babylon, a woman of scarlet on 7 hills, golden cup and fornications included. The whore of Babylon had a publisher now. Reformers cataloged clerical sins with a relish that often obscured the line between individual vice and institutional rot. Some charges were fair. Concubinage among priests was common. Simony was a plague. Nepotism was a tax on souls. Others were fantasies built on the architecture of a single provocative story, like the chestnuts, multiplied and spread by enemies who knew that sex sells paper. Writers of the 17th century, like Gregorio Leti, an exile from Rome with a pen dipped in acid, wrote lives of popes that read like masked balls of accusation. He told stories about Sixtus V and others that historians today treat as cautionary tales about sources. Ferrante Pallavicino, satirist, wrote pieces that got him killed by the papal state, a testament to the nerve endings exposed when one poked Rome in public. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, the line did not hold. Some cardinals kept mistresses openly. They were princes, and the church winked at princes until it didn't. The most famous courtesans dined in houses across the Tiber, and poets celebrated their hair and wit with a candor that makes moralists blush. When Queen Christina of Sweden arrived in the 1650s, she turned her Roman palace into a salon where philosophy, music, and rumor mingled. Some sources say her evenings relaxed into something softer than philosophy. But orgies? Only if you prefer the label to the evidence. This is how a meme is born and survives. It feeds on events, some real, some embroidered, and then it feeds on itself. The Vatican as orgy becomes a genre. People read it, not as news, but as a way to feel a truth. That power and pleasure make hypocrites of even the pious. The feeling may be justified, the details stranger, rarer, and more mundane than the word suggests. The pamphlets did one more thing. They forced Rome to answer. And its answer, when it came, was thunder. Before we hear it, let's walk, once quietly, into the rooms themselves, the diaries, the calendars, the schedules of a day in the papal court, to ask what actually happened when no one was trying to run a morality play. History's thunder is loud, but daily life is a whisper. Listen, a papal day began early. Matins, brief sleep, meetings. The Pope received ambassadors in chambers hung with tapestries. Masters of ceremonies fussed about hymns and hours. A consistory of cardinals debated benefices and war. Petitions piled like snowdrifts. Meals were timely, political, surprisingly spare, or surprisingly sumptuous, depending on the guest list. A papal table signaled what was served mattered less than who was served first. Cardinals lived like princes. Their households were mini courts with secretaries, kitchen staff, grooms, musicians, fools. They were expected to show magnificence. In Italian politics, magnificence was a public virtue, the expenditure of wealth for the sake of shared glory. Banquets, masquerades, processions, and theatrical entertainments were part of that grammar. To refuse to stage them could look like stinginess or weakness. The moral cost was this: a noble cardinal charged with chastity moved through a culture that asked him to perform generosity in sensual terms. Rome had regulated brothels, like every big city. Courtesans were not streetwalkers. They were educated, witty, housed, fashionable. Some became legendary. Imperia cognati wielded the power of a hostess, taking poets as clients and cardinals as friends. Tullia d'Aragona debated philosophy, wrote poetry, and hosted salons where the air was thick with compliments and calculation. To call those salons orgies is to confess a desire for simplicity. They were messy rooms where the demands of image, desire, and patronage tangled. Pre-Trident Rome accepted clerical concubinage as a sin the church scolded but often tolerated. It was a known thing, more administrative headache than apocalypse. Parish priests had housekeepers who were women. Bishops fathered children. Some acknowledged them. The hypocrisy is obvious. The scandal is too. But the horror stories of anonymous debauch would have surprised many Romans, who had a more realistic sense of how ordinary vice works. Slowly, stubbornly, without fireworks. When the church finally resolved to draw a sharp line, it did so with chilling resolve. The Council of Trent, convened in 1545 and concluding in 1563, announced discipline like a bass note. Seminaries were founded. Clerical celibacy was enforced with a new vigor. Pius V, the Dominican, tightened Rome like a belt. He attacked prostitution, closed some theaters, and purged the calendar of careless frivolity. There were fewer masked evenings inside palace walls and more sermons about the danger of masks themselves. Naples and Venice still partied. So did Rome, but more carefully. The papal court did not cease to be a court. There were still visits, dinners, singers, gifts, and 100 small temptations. But the grand fusions of culture and license that defined the High Renaissance dimmed. Baroque Rome turned spectacle into piety. Processions as theater, Bernini's altars as operas in stone, fireworks to mark saints' days rather than secret nights. And yet even in the Baroque, people were people. Donna Olympia Medalcini, sister-in-law to Pope Innocent X, drew troops of rumor. Who was she to wield such influence over the papacy? Did she run a salon where flirtation softened policy? Some sources say she pocketed bribes. Others that she simply filled the power vacuum men left. The accusation of sexual impropriety is an old tool used against women who act like men in politics. It was wielded here with a predictability that would be funny if it were not so cruel. What did it look like then when a truly wild night happened in Rome? Probably like any aristocratic party in any city. Candles licked low, wine turned urgent, jokes thickened, a pair or two disappeared into a side room while the rest laughed. Sometimes a cardinal fell hard. Sometimes he learned to fear the morning. Sometimes a story made its way to Pasquino, and Rome relearned the lesson. Morality is not an endless frown. It is a set of lines people cross at different paces. The Vatican was not immune. This is not to exonerate. It is to humanize. It is to say that the ugliest stories are often the best sellers, and that a word like orgy can flatten a dozen kinds of human hunger into a single, titillating headline. We have walked across 4 centuries in soft shoes. We have stared into candlelight and read angry small print. We have seen that some stories are true, some half-true, some sharpened into weapons, and all human. Let's close the door gently. So, did the papal court keep secrets no teacher dare to tell? Yes. Rome is a city of secrets. Some are carved into marble, some spilled like wine, staining reputations for generations. The Banquet of Chestnuts remains a flickering scene, half fact, half fantasy, hard to stop watching. Leo's masked knights show how art and appetite became politics. John XI's legend teaches what happens when enemies write your biography. And the pamphlets reveal a world learning to sell scandal by the page. The truth is quieter. Power attracts pleasure like a magnet draws iron. Men who promised holiness were also men, some failing with flair, others with the silence of routine. Then came reform, and the world turned, and the carnival mask slipped back into its box. If this journey helped you see Rome's shadows and its light more clearly, subscribe for more calm dives into the corners of history others leave in the dark. And remember, the best defense against a weaponized rumor is a patient ear.